We're letting people in now. Now we have to invite them in one by one. And just so that you know, you will also be placed in silent. And so Miriam, if you'll just let me know when we let everybody in.
Yes, we are opening
good.
up the waiting room. So as more people come in, they'll start joining. Yes, we are good.
Wonderful.
We are live
Thank
as
you,
well.
Miriam.
We're recording.
Thank you. And so again, welcome everyone. My name is Hilda Cruz. I'm the regional faith organizer in the Inland Valleys in Southern California. I remind you again, if you did not hear me before, we are inviting you to share your name and the name of your organization or congregation in the chat box. We usually look forward to knowing who is joining us. And for those of you who may not know us, the Interfaith Movement for Human Integrity is a statewide organization that mobilizes people of faith in the Los Angeles region, San Francisco Bay Area, and the Inland Valleys. The Inland Valleys is the Riverside and San Bernardino counties. We advance, for racial equity and human rights in two programs, which is one is immigrant justice and also in the ending of mass criminalization. Let me begin also by sharing that housekeeping items for this meeting. All attendees will remain on mute. You may type questions in the chat box throughout any portion of the webinar. We will respond to these questions at the end of the webinar. And a recording of the webinar and the slides will be shared after today. This is our third series of webinars where we share and practice faith-rooted organizing. In this model of organizing, people are at the center of our work, and it is through prayer, formation, and solidarity that we undertake the work of decarceration. In this particular webinar, we will give an update on strategies that implement AB 32, and we will also focus on a very important step in faith-rooted organizing, which is critical analysis of the social context. And so Miriam will now invite us into what we practice, which is the spiritual centering prayer.
Thank you. I invite everyone to join me for a small guided reflection or meditation. So let us pause to envision a beloved community where all can live together, where everyone respects the dignity of all people, and the end goal is reconciliation and wholeness. And if you feel comfortable, you can close your eyes and envision this beloved community a reality in the future generations, where our great-great-great-grandchildren are reaping the fruits of true justice with one another. And if we were to be able to write a message to our great-great-grandchildren about what sustains your hope in these times, what message would that be? And you can use the chat box when you are ready to share this message with one another.
I don't know why the Zoom thing isn't working.
So the chat box can be found at the bottom of your screen where it says chat. And when you are ready, you can share what that message would be with your great-great-grandchildren as we envision what this beloved community would look like a reality in our future with our future descendants. We believe that a people without a vision perish. That is a very common proverb for the community. And that's why we practice the spiritual centering of envisioning. So for those who have joined recently, we are starting with a brief reflection of envisioning a future of a beloved community. And we are sharing what that vision would look like in our future descendants. And if we could send them a message of what sustained our hope today, so that reality could be fulfilled for them, what would that message be? And we're sharing this message in the chat box with one another. Thank you, Marilyn, who shares her message that says, people working together sustains me. And then Kim says, I create a path for you, my great-grandchildren, to have spaciousness and freedom to live out your dreams. Thank you, Kim, so beautiful. Jeffrey shares, spirit is always guiding and directing life. There's another message from Catherine. Today we live with hope that future generations will live without fear of differences. And Martha shares, we are one world, one people, one dream, one hope. Thank you so much for these messages. It's so important for us to continue to keep this in the foresight. And then we'll conclude this brief moment of sharing with this prayer. With this meditation, with this prayer. O Creator of life, who made us in your divine image, you gaze upon the human family with compassion. May each one of us be healed from the fear, hatred, and indifference that infects our hearts and prevents us to behold one another's dignity. Move us, life-giving Spirit, to make amends and act in solidarity towards those who are suffering from oppression. May each one of us reach out to liberate those who are incarcerated, to reunite separated families, and offer hospitality into our communities. May it be so. Amen. And I will pass it on to Hilda Cruz, who would tell us a little bit more about our organization.
So in our organization, we practice collective liberation. And it is part of the faith-rooted model that compels us to hold on to a vision that is not only what we practice today, but we're always foreseeing it for our future generations. And we see it unfolding throughout our solidarity work. And so in the Bay Area, through the work of faith organizer Gayla King, Miriam Noriega, who you've heard speak already, and Executive Director Reverend Deborah Lee. They have shown these efforts to end immigration detention and have worked on freedom campaigns for the releases of many, many immigrants in the Bay Area. In Los Angeles, we have Reverend Dr. Larry Foy, who supports our efforts to stop new jail constructions and advocate for mental health. And then in the Inland Empire, that's me, Hilda Cruz. And through visiting Adelanto Detention Center, we have worked on the freedom campaigns for many people also. And we also support the advocacy to stop the expansion of the Adelanto Immigrant Detention Facility. Part of our framework that we use to take on for this faith organizing model is Mend the Past, which addresses the root cause of institutional racism of this country that forms punitive incarceration systems and justifies it by racially scapegoating through people of color and immigrants through a narrative of criminalizing them. We also have, as a framework, Heal the Present. We liberate and accompany people most impacted by incarceration so we can learn how the private prison system colludes with policy, economy, and mainstream news. So we can better organize to advocate for policies that change these systems. And our last part of our framework is to transform the future. And we do this by the vision that we hold together for the future as we create a beloved community. During this year, we have these 3 statewide campaigns that we are prioritizing through our Mend, Heal, and Transform framework. And that is to stop the collaboration between ICE and prisons, ending for-profit private prisons and immigrant detention in California, and the Drop Life Without Parole. And Miriam will explain who we network with and we are partners and allies with.
Yes, our organization has had the great privilege to be working alongside with all the organizations that you see here on your right-hand side of the PowerPoint. All of us together are working in a coalition called Dignity Not Detention. And what it is, it's the effort to end the for-profit private prison system in the state of California that affects both mass incarceration and the immigration detention system. And through this coalition is how we have been working together to, in 2019, advocate and help encourage Governor Newsom to pass AB 32. And in this year, we are working really hard to make sure that GEO and ICE do not circumvent that and that is passed. And Hilda will explain a little bit more about that.
So through AB 32, legislation that was helped with the help of the coalition last year was a law that was spearheading in California that would phase out for-profit private prison industry and also the immigration detention industry. I'm happy to say that other states are taking a look to replicate this legislation that for us is now law. And this law, when we passed it, would prohibit California Department of Corrections and Rehabilitation from entering into and also renewing contracts with a for-profit private prison beginning January 1st, 2028. And for those that had existing contracts, it would phase out by 2028. The second part that it would do would prohibit all forms of for-profit detention in California, like the immigration detention facility in Adelanto. And Contracts that existed would continue, but they would not be able to be renewed. Yet what we saw at the end of December was ICE undermining this legislation by securing 15-year contracts in these 5 facilities. You know, the one that's called the Golden State, the Central Valley one, Mesa Verde, the Adelanto, which also would expand to the Desert View. I think it's like 750 more beds in the city of Adelanto. And not only that, but we also saw that ICE is suing also the state of California for the passing of AB 32. And so with all of our allies and these people in the coalition, we got together and decided that we needed to take up strategies of resistance. And as we see, these facilities were chosen in very small remote towns where very specific political landscapes would benefit the corporations. And in this way, they would also connect with the local politicians to be able to continue to seek expansion. And so with a coalition, we really thought that we needed to stop new contracts and work on stopping the expansion of these existing facilities, and also to continue to help liberate people in detention. And a lot of organizing has gone into the city of McFarland, and still the city council approved the expansion of 400 beds in the month in April. The city of Adelanto continues to seek the approval of the city council to be able to expand to an additional 750 bed facility in Adelanto, continue to make it one of the biggest detention facilities in all of the state of California. And so I just want to share with you the power, how I witnessed the power of people and what it really does, because for the last 2 months, when the ICE and GEO have approached the city council to approve on this expansion, the mobilizing of people and the bombarding of the city council members with both letters, comments, and emails from people of faith have actually moved them to either postpone this issue from a vote or continue to moving it on. And so I think the importance of what we're seeing in this resistance is how people of faith and organizing, faith-rooted organizing, really does impact the decision of these policymakers. My work in Adelanto for the last 6 years have never seen so much movement as it has recently throughout this year in Adelanto. And so one of the things that I realize is that the more people learn about this corruption, about how families are impacted, the more people are willing to step in and say no more. And so even though we still await for another round of city council meetings, and we will also continue to fight that, we are also seeing the liberation of people. In the Mesa Verde, we have seen last week 15 women were released, and then 13 males followed. And that was due through litigation that was brought on by the whole COVID-19 movement right now. In Adelanto, we were not so lucky to see that big movement that we were expecting, but we are seeing 1 to 5 persons daily that are being released through humanitarian parole or bonds that are being paid. And so part of the invitation is to continue to work on this resistance strategies, as we will also continue to focus on ICE, because we know that they do have the authority to release all of the people in detention. And so with that, that is my update on Adelanto. And I would like to invite now my colleague, Reverend Larry, to talk a little bit about the decarceration movement in our work.
Good afternoon, everyone, and thanks for joining our webinar. Let me begin by defining what we mean by decarceration. Decarceration, the basic definition of decarceration is a government policy, or the government policy of reducing either the number of persons in prison or reducing the rate of those entering into prison in a particular jurisdiction. However, decarceration, real decarceration, is more than that. Decarceration means more than getting individuals out of prison. It means healing trauma, restoring civil rights, and atoning for the suffering that this system, which I'm going to talk about, the system of mass incarceration, has imposed upon American families and communities, particularly families and communities of color. So that's basic reference point for decarceration. So how do we get to what we call decarceration today? How did we get from mass incarceration to decarceration? Let me talk just a few minutes about mass incarceration. Mass incarceration is that era that started really in the 80s, actually could go back to the 70s. We are from that point, at least 1980s, all the way up to 2009. The U.S. government implemented tough on crime laws, which resulted in the prison population exploding in the United States from roughly 300,000 around the 1980s. And by the 2009, 2010, it had imploded to about 2 million, over 2 million people. So much so that the United States had become, and still remains, the #1 prison in the whole United States. That is, the United States incarcerate more people in prison than any other country in the world. And out of all of the prison folks incarcerated, United States prison population is 25% of the world's prison population. And it's the tough on crime laws that so impacted our country, and especially communities of color, persons of color, that now over 70 million people in the United States alone has a criminal conviction or past criminal history. And 5 million people, in addition to 2 million people who are now in prison, have are either in jail or under supervision, or they are on parole. So what we have had up until 2009 is the household warehousing of people, mostly for nonviolent crimes. And so around 2009, the government took action, particularly here in California. The U.S. government looked at the overcrowding in California jails and California prisons. And the U.S. Supreme Court actually ruled that the California must begin to release folk to ease overcrowding because the conditions were horrible, but most importantly, it violated the Constitution and the civil rights of those being in prison. So that's how we actually began the shift of decarceration, at least in California, basically with that court ruling in 2011. But let me be clear. It's not the government, in fact, who is responsible really for the decarceration movement. It's really the decarceration movement actually started with people, with incarcerated people and incarcerated people. It started for back as the 1980s, early 70s, as a counter movement, even with people like Angela Davis, who was a now professor and a civil rights activist, as many of you well know. But it even started with her and started with other folk in prison who began to organize and began to protest about the conditions of prison. Basically, they began to protest uh, about the violence that they were encountering in prison, either from guards or being placed in gang units where gang members were their enemies. They began to protest about unhealthy food and lack of education, lack of job training, lack of job skills, lack of rehabilitation programs in prison. And so the protest in prisons is sort of a precursor to the whole formal decarceration movement. Then the second step is when folk got released from prison, formerly incarcerated persons began to organize. And since they could not find work, a lot of these folk could not find suitable work, they formed their own organizations. I think of people like Dorsey Nunn, for instance, in San Francisco, now in Oakland, I believe, who actually founded All of Us and None, which is a movement of formerly incarcerated people and their family members fighting for the civil rights and restoration of those who have been incarcerated. You think of people like Susan Burton of the New Way of Life in Los Angeles, and just a number of other formerly incarcerated people throughout the country began to organize and to make demands for the restoration of their rights. Simple demands for being able to apply for a job without being discriminated against. And so you had what we call Ban the Box, which was an initiative that Dorsey Nunn and others rallied around with all the way back in the 1990s. The Ban the Box was that little checkbox on the application, the job application, that asks you the basic questions. Have you ever committed a crime? And that box, that question alone excluded people who had been incarcerated from having job opportunities. So the decarceration movement started with these folk, and it will continue with these folk. They, made other demands in terms of public benefits, be able to get access to food stamps and other services after being released. Upon being released, they asked for educational opportunities. They began to fight for housing opportunities and the restoration for their right to vote. So all of these actions were begun with formerly incarcerated persons. And as they began to build momentum, this is when public opinion began to change. And as public opinion began to change in 2010, around 2010 up until now, there's been a massive effort among other people, other organizations, other civil rights activists, among academicians, among scholars, among foundations to support this effort. And it's only then through these efforts that the government really began to get involved and to say that we have to do something about this. We have to undo the damage that has been done. So the decarceration movement is now moving forward with legislation. As we see the legislation we had with AB 109, which called for the release of prisoners in California. Subsequent legislation included AB 47. Prop 64 was even a piece that reduced the prison population. And as Hilda mentioned a minute ago, we're working on AB 32, and that's to try to abolish detentions in prison, in private prisons. So having said all of this, what does decarceration and what should decarceration look like? Decarceration should be and is a part of beloved community. I think suggest 5 things, and this is the best of the things that the formerly incarcerated community were demanding. It should be, the incarceration should include full employment with living wages for those who are being released. It should include full access to education and funding, because now folk cannot get federal dollars if they have been convicted, or especially for drugs. It should include removal of police from our K-12 schools. With the presence of police in schools, you now have what we call the prison, the school to prison pipeline, where people have been being arrested. Young kids are being arrested, school placed in juvenile and moved, and so forth. It should include access to housing, full access to housing. You have private owners or landlords now who do not allow formerly incarcerated people to have access to housing if they will not rent to them. It should include among housing, along with education, and full employment. It should also include the full right to vote. Just some of these things in and of itself is what I think, even what Dr. King talked about, his beloved community, where everybody has equal access, everybody has equal opportunity within society. Formerly incarcerated persons and people in prison or in detention centers should not be and continue to be punished. They need to be restored back into the community, and I think this is an important role that the faith community should play and can play, because we are a community that believes in forgiveness and in restoration. So I hope you will join us as we seek to move forward and to stand in solidarity with those who are seeking to be restored in society.
Thank you, Larry. Reverend Larry Foy has a lot of life experiences around this topic, and we appreciate that summary so we can get a bigger picture as to where we are moving towards a movement of decarceration and liberation. I will now be presenting a brief explanation and training on faith-rooted organizing, which is what our organization, Interfaith Movement for Human Integrity, models itself after to shape all of our campaigns and actions. The intention of the faith-rooted organizing model is for the faith values of various faith traditions and spiritual practices to form our organizing and advocacy efforts. We want to acknowledge that it is part of a broader justice movement, like we were just mentioning about Dignity Not Detention Coalition, the larger decarceration movement, because everyone has its role. We use the metaphor of a body that has different members working together in their specific way. So is also this broader justice movement that faith-rooted organizing is part of. So we work with schools, legal service providers, workers, policymakers, etc. Yet our specific role in that larger movement is to empower people and congregations to really embody their faith and spiritual practices when they are advocating for justice. And specifically, we want to talk a little about what faith-rooted analysis is, and which is basically all organizing must contain an analysis of the social context. It requires us to think a little bit deeper and ask ourselves these questions, like, what is the root causes of this systemic injustice? What is the mainstream narrative? What is the status quo response? Are we placing at the center those who are most impacted? Making an analysis from faith values, such as sacred scriptures, theological reflections, make a significant contribution to this movement in 2 specific ways. The first one is it nourishes hope when we are feeling fatigued and defeated. There's a story that Dolores Huerta tells us of a moment when she was the vice president of the United Farm Workers Movement, and she felt they had lost the struggle and it was time to admit defeat. And to this, Cesar Chavez responded to her, "It's time to look through the eyes of faith." As communities of faith, we take seriously the ministry of prayer, the ministry of accompanying families who are separated due to incarceration and immigration detention. And we are in solidarity by advocating for the liberation and restoration of these loved ones. The second role of faith-rooted is that we have the power to unveil the lies that sustain systemic injustice with revealing the divine truths of our particular faith practice. It is our obligation as ministers, lay members, clergy, any person of faith, to really take this as our sole responsibility, because unfortunately we know past and current instances when our faith is used to perpetuate these lies with an interpretation of scriptures and like this is the one and only truth. Also, sadly, sometimes it is our faith communities that are complacent due to the injustices right now, and sometimes given to the fear of scarcity or backlash. Sadly, this is destructive to the larger community because it is not living up to its divine calling of being transformative agents of justice. So we must use our faith values to unveil these lies. The lies demonstrate that racism is the root of pervasive systemic injustices, such as the mass incarceration system and the enforcement of immigration into the US. Lies work by creating a mainstream narrative that criminalizes communities of color and immigrants through scapegoating. And that justifies some of the laws that we are trying to combat these today. History teaches us that no matter how many laws we organize to pass, if there is no cultural shift to reveal these root causes, these lies of racism will come again disguised in a different way. For example, the civil rights movement made an analysis that the lie, "some people are worth more than others," was what sustained the cultural narrative that it is illegal for Black people to exercise their right to vote. It was illegal for all people of color to congregate in the same space, even illegal to ask and demand quality education, housing, and other resources. So in their analysis of unveiling this lie, the truth that they revealed from their particular Christian faith was, we are all God's children, and we are all loved equally regardless of our race. And I want to make a special note about these truths, that they are most effective when it comes from the people who are suffering from the systemic injustice, which is why this truth during the civil rights movement was so powerful, because it came from those who are most impacted and allowed people who wanted to be intolerant to join them as well, to prove that it's true. This specifically is what I have learned and taken on in my experience with participating in the Dreamer movement in the early 2000s. When I was a student demonstrating with others across the country, revealing the truth that no human being is illegal, and boldly saying, undocumented and unafraid, I have noticed it has made a dramatic cultural shift at how the country views immigrants, from burdens to assets. But yeah, we still have a lot of work to do in this movement, from going a little bit deeper and changing the cultural narrative of choosing the good immigrants, such as some folks like myself who kind of benefited from DACA and moved up, choosing us over the quote unquote bad immigrant, which is people who are criminal, have a criminal conviction. We still have work to do, but this is the work that we're doing today, and we're hoping you join us. So now we want to hear from you. We want to hear the lies that you have heard that justify the culture of criminalization that criminalizes people of color and immigrants. We'd like for you to share them in the chat box. And then also, from your particular faith tradition or spiritual practice, what truths would you say to counteract that lie? So we'll give a few moments for people to think about this and share them in the chat box, because by no means do we assume that we know it all right now in this presentation. And we need actually everyone's participation to continue to unpack these lies and counteract them with the truth. So take a moment to think about these two questions and put them in the chat box. So what are some of those lies that we hear in our culture that justify making laws to criminalize people of color and immigrants? Feel free to share it in the chat box, which again, you can find below. So here's one lie from Maryland. Immigrants take more than they give. Another lie shared by Maria Guadalupe, they deserve it. Knowing that this statement refers to disadvantaged groups and minorities. Other lies that we're hearing from is immigrants will take away our jobs. Hardworking Americans are unable to get jobs because of immigrants. Thank you. The other lie we are hearing from is undocumented people who are deported and returned without going through the legal process is a criminal. I wonder if there are any other lies out there that probably hear that justify the mass incarceration of people of color in general, especially one of those that may come up during Black Lives Matter. While people are thinking of those, here's some truths that people are writing. Immigrants contribute, this is a truth that Marilyn wrote. Immigrants contribute through their work, strength, and culture. As we come together through our diversity, we are stronger.
One of the lies that Kim's lifting up is, they're criminals, so they deserve to be in prison.
Yes. Mm-hmm. Okay, we'll take one or two more and then we'll move forward.
That's kind of echoed in this one. They must have done something or they wouldn't be,
They must,
in jail and detained.
Thank you. We invite you to keep thinking about this, keep sharing them in the chat box so we can all hear from you and we can hear from one another. What we're going to do right now is we're going to continue this interactive practice. So myself, Reverend Larry, and Hilda have worked through an attempt to address some of the lies that we are hearing and reflecting on when it comes to the culture of criminalizing both people of color and immigrants. However, by no means does this mean that we have the answer or the truth. Actually, that's why it's truths, plural, and lies, plural, because there's many. So what we'll do is we're going to take turns to share one, and then after they share, we're going to do the same thing of you all addressing your comments or other lies and truths that you've heard, particularly that pertains to that lie and the truth. So I'm going to invite Hilda to share the first one.
Thank you, Miriam. So one of the lies that has impacted me as a Mexican woman was hearing that all people who are, all Black and brown people have cultural tendency to not follow the rules, and they get themselves into trouble with the law. And so as a Mexican woman and of the color of my skin, I have experienced being questioned either at DUI checkpoints. I get easily pulled over, or through security at airports. I usually am questioned, am asked, and I think it is because, for whatever reason, biases is one way where officers have been taught to take a look at these people and find out what it is that they have done wrong. And so we have this historical impact of racism where people of color have been criminalized as the other. The other is the slave, the criminal, the terrorist, a threat, a danger. And specifically, most recently after 9/11, we saw it with the Arab population, right? They must be terrorists themselves. And so all of these ideas are based on the ideology of white supremacy that is still practiced today. And so part of the truth that I have seen is that racial stereotypes are created culturally, reinforced by this white supremacy. And so the truth of that is every person's dignity is sacred, and we have a collective and societal responsibility for one another to thrive and to grow with integrity. And one of the ways, the stories that I can talk when you look at the African American community is their truth is the fact that they're a culture that have very strong faith values of nonviolence. They practice reconciliation and are called to a strong calling and practice of trying to create a beloved community. And so those are the types of stories that I think about as I talk about this lie and this truth. So I invite now, I believe we're inviting people to share. When you think about this lie that people who are Black and brown have a cultural tendency to not follow the rules and they get themselves into trouble with a law, what are the truths that you might think about that you would counter that narrative? And so we invite you to chat on that right now.
So we have one from Deborah. Racial stereotypes have been developed to uphold white supremacy and continue to live today, and their impact must be questioned. Another truth, racial profiling targets immigrant communities and communities of color. Another truth is white people usually don't see racism and biases because they can count on being given the benefit of the doubt. Thank you so much. We're going to have to move on to the next one, but please continue to write these truths to share with one another. And Larry will share our next one.
Here's the lie. People who are Black and brown have a cultural tendency to not follow the rules and to get themselves into trouble with the law.
Oh, it's the next one,
Is that
Larry.
the one?
No,
Sorry,
the next one. The prisons and law enforcement.
Right, I'm reading. Sorry. Okay. Here's the lie. Prisons and law enforcement are the most effective ways to make us feel protected from criminals. What about the truth? The truth is a society of justice is one that restores the relationship between the victim, perpetrator, and the communal or communal relationship. This is really a suggestion that we have to look at justice in a different light. We have to reimagine justice. In this country, sadly and unfortunately, again, we have believed the lie that justice can only be meted out through the courts or through law enforcement. Imagine this, where there's a real opportunity for the victim to have a conversation, if you will, with her, his perpetrator, to ask what or why the perpetrator did what he or she did. In the same token, or by the same token, it would be an opportunity for the victim to offer, for the perpetrator to offer amends and to make amends for her, his action. Imagine a scenario where actually justice is enacted or carried out through acts of mercy, forgiveness, restoration, and reconciliation. I can think of a number of cases where people have family members of victims of family members who have lost a family member by way of a crime have actually reached out and demonstrated forgiveness and extended mercy and wanted to see the person restored back into society as living out a lifetime of punishment. I think our community, the faith-rooted community, can certainly help facilitate this kind of justice, or practice of justice in our society.
Thanks, Larry. That was really insightful. So why don't we take a couple of moments for people to, again, respond to the truths that you are seeing from this specific lie. Prisons and law enforcement are the most effective ways to make us feel protected from criminals. So we have Deborah Garfinkel say, many laws have been created expressly to enforce segregation and injustice, not safety and justice. Thank you. Marilyn says, justice must be tempered by mercy. Thank you for those truths. What are other ones? What are some other truths that your faith tradition tells you that makes us understand that this is a lie that sustains a system of criminalizing people of color and immigrants? Share with us in the chat box. Current prisons focus on punishment rather than rehabilitation. That's one truth shared by Carolina. Then one last one. Often the perpetrators are law enforcement, which makes us feel less safe. Thank you. Please continue to share, and I'm going to share the third one. So the third lie that we've been reflecting on is releasing people with criminal convictions from prison is a danger to society. And what if we think about the truth of we believe in the ability of personal restoration and to be given an opportunity of a second chance? In this time that I have been working with the Interfaith movement for human integrity and advocating for liberation of people who are incarcerated, I've been working with a lot of congregations, and I've seen such a really interesting conversion, if I can say, happening, where when we often hear about a person with a criminal conviction, there is this idea of there's just the inherently bad nature of the person. But that does not really fit with some of our faith values that people have inherent goodness. That's why we were created in its divine image. And so therefore we have the capacity to be restored. That people have a capacity for personal restoration. And when people contemplate this at the beginning, when congregations are trying to figure out, should we support someone who is a formerly incarcerated person, or who was in immigration detention center and were kind of worried about what they were convicted of that led them to this state. It's really interesting to see the shift that happens when the people in the congregation start to learn more about this person as a whole and kind of step back from that focus on a past criminal conviction. They start to learn about their leadership capacity inside, their faith, the amazing parents or children that their families are hoping to return. And then a relationship happens. And then all of a sudden, from first being hesitant to accompany or host someone with a past criminal conviction, willing to open themselves up to these divine truths, and then now form a relationship, now they become advocates for liberation for others. And also because of there's this process. And I really enjoy that part of the work. And I think this is why the lies and the truths are helpful. So for this last one, what would be the truths that you can think of? To the lie, releasing people with criminal convictions from prison is a danger to society. So we have one comment that says, no individual should be reduced to the worst thing they have done in their life. Being human is about change and growth and how we have to help individuals to self-actualize instead of self-destruct. And thank you, Deborah. That was very helpful and insightful. And then one more to share. We have to see people in their full light, full humanity, full complexity of their roots, context, and situation. Mistakes do not define a person. And then last one, everyone makes mistakes. We have to learn, and once we learn, we have to grow. Thank you everyone for participating with us in this interactive. And I hope that this has helped you to do an analysis of the lies that we are trying to address in this culture of criminalization. So that concludes this piece, and we're going to move on to the next steps and call to actions. Obviously, we are recording this webinar so you can see it again or share it with other people so they can also probably participate in this exercise that we just did. So you can see this webinar on our website, but we will also send it to your emails afterwards. Every Friday for the past 7 weeks, we've been having a Faithful Friday action, which is how you can advocate and even lift up these truths that all of you have shared on social media platforms to ensure that there's more liberation of people and a true end of mass incarceration and immigration detention. You will probably be receiving more announcements of what that will look like in the following weeks in your emails. And then I would invite Larry to invite you to our third webinar.
Yes, we'd like to invite you to our third webinar, which will be on Drop Life Without Parole. This webinar will take place on May 29th at the same time that we convened today, 12 to 1 p.m. Learn about life without parole, where persons who in that movement define life without parole as the second death penalty. Join us for it tends to be interesting, enlightening, and interesting discussion. May 9th, May 29th.
Okay, and then I'll pass it to Deborah and our other staff for a call to actions.
Well, first of all, I just want to thank everyone for joining today. I want to thank our staff, Dr. Foy, Hilda, and Miriam for doing a great job in preparing today and for teaching today. And for all of your comments. I think I'm very heartened by all the comments. I want us to keep thinking and exercising this muscle of speaking the truth and speaking the truth from our faith and our values, because we have to counteract, centuries of other messages that, people just can rattle them off, all these lies and negative stereotypes. So we are in the business, and I think that's one of the powers that we have as the faith community, to really state another reality, to really state the truth and the beauty and the integrity and the sacredness of each person. So let's keep doing this work together. And as you know, this work isn't just to do it for the sake of doing that and developing the narratives, but to how do we develop the narratives to impact policy? How do we develop the narratives to impact a shift in consciousness and a shift in people's lives? So there's 3 calls to action we have. I'm going to share the first one. As many of you know, that as Hilda already mentioned, we're being sued as a state of California by GEO for the passage of that law that bans private prisons. So we want to invite people to participate. One of the great things about shelter in place is now that court hearing will be online. So we'll all be able to watch. It starts at 1:30 on June 18th. There's a bit.ly there of how you can sign up and register to watch. We'll be doing a press conference. The Dignity Not Detention Coalition will be doing a press conference at 11:30, also on Zoom. So if you want to join, then there'll be a break for lunch and then you can join the court hearing. But I think it's really important that we try to get more eyes, more witnesses, more, because I think we're not quite there yet. The fact that GEO was able to do all these under the table deals shows that we don't quite have the narrative. We don't have the cultural shift around banning private prisons yet. And so we need to do more around that. So I hope you can join us for that. Gayla, would you like to explain the last 2?
Sure. Hi, everyone. So the next 2 call to action, as you've been seeing and hearing of the efforts to call for the release of people in the horrid conditions inside jails, prisons, and ICE detentions, one of the responses of the faith community has been for congregations who have many buildings are closed due to shelter in place to open up housing and to house people post-release. So we already have a few congregations in the Bay Area that are housing people. A few more are getting ready. And we welcome you to join us if you think your congregation would be interested in that. So please contact me and I can share more information. The 3rd call to action, for those of you that have joined our other webinar focused on the Vision Act, an update is that unfortunately the Vision Act, which was to end transfers from prisons and jails to ICE, that bill that was authored by Bonta is not moving forward this legislative cycle. It didn't make it into the shortened list of the Public Safety Committee. But the next strategy is to urge the governor to actually use his executive power to stop these transfers. So we just wanted to give you an update and to look out. There will most likely be another press conference on this next week, and we're going to want to reach out to all of our electeds to get their support in putting this kind of pressure on Governor Newsom. So look out for more information about that.
And we have one more from Hilda Cruz, our organizer in the Inland Empire.
And the invitation of that one, or the call to action, is to participate in this, what I call the Interfaith, the IE Faith Collaborative. We will be meeting via Zoom on May 28th, and this is when we kind of strategize about what's happening in Adelanto, how many people we can help, and we talked about all of these different campaigns that we are working statewide. So please contact me. You see my email there if you would like to be invited into this faith collaborative. Thank you.
We will open now for any questions that may have come up. And please use the chat box to help us hear everyone's questions. Sometimes if you unmute, there's a lot of noise and it's hard to hear the person. So if you can type in your question in the chat box, we'll be more than happy to attempt to respond it.
I did get one comment that the bit.ly for registering for the June 18th lawsuit didn't seem to work. So I would tell people to go to our Facebook page or the calendar on our website, and there should be the correct link there. Sorry, I must have missed a letter. So our
Thanks,
Facebook
Deborah.
page, yeah, I'll paste it in the chat.
Thanks. Any other questions? We have one question from Andrew. Do we have an idea of how many transfers from prison to ICE are currently taking place? Kayla, I think if you want to do that one.
That's a really good question. We're actually trying to find that out. So we know that both Assemblymember Bonta, who was the author of the bill, as well as Asian Law Caucus have been putting in what is the Freedom of Information Act to try to find out more information on this. So we don't know the exact numbers, but as soon as we get that, we're definitely want to share and lift it up. We do know that within our state prison system, around 11,000 have ICE holds. So that basically means those individuals, once they are deemed eligible for release, ICE is able to transfer them as long as we allow them to continue to do that. So that's about 11,000 people that we know of.
Thank you.
Which is about 9% of the prison population.
Thanks. See, what are some other questions? I responded to Alfred's question in the chat box about there being a transcript, but it looks like Hilda, you have a question you want to answer.
Yeah, you want to read that question?
Sure. What was the result of the recent letter campaign to the City Council of Adelanto?
So I believe we had 95 different faith leaders write letters, comments, and emails into the 4 different city council members and the mayor in the city of Adelanto. While they did not say that it had any impact, I think it was a good movement for them to, the day before, decide not to talk about the issue. And so they keep postponing on the issue of the issue of the expansion in Adelanto. But here's what I saw. The last time we met in person back in early February, there was a meeting to talk about the expansion. GEOs mobilized into having the hall and the city council to be completely filled with people from GEO personnel. And so the group that attended weren't even able to go in there, even though we showed up really early. What we realized then was that GEO was also allowing people to go in and say comments through the back door and really limiting those people that were opposed to the expansion of GEO. So one of the things that I saw this past Monday is, even though the issue of expansion was not on the agenda, people were calling in to comment on it. And they had no idea who was behind the call, right? They couldn't mobilize to set up in favor of GEO. And so there was about 15 different comments of people who were opposed to the expansion. And when they realized that most of these comments were in opposition, they went ahead and they stopped receiving calls and decided to let people know that until they put it on the agenda again, they didn't want to hear anymore about the expansion. And so again, to me, that was witnessing of the power of mobilizing, right? And really having the moral courage to say this is wrong. And the vote, we haven't seen a vote yet, but we see them continue to postpone it. And we will continue to keep our ears and eyes really open to mobilize against what they're trying to do. So thank you for asking that question.
Yeah. And one last follow-up. What does GEO stand for? For some people, it's their first time hearing about it.
Deb, do you want to take that one?
I'm thinking, what does
I'm
GEO
thinking
stand
too.
for? Well, basically,
it's an acronym.
It's an acronym, but GEO and Core Civic are the 2 largest private prison corporations in the country. And so that's the important thing that you need to know. Not only are they involved in incarceration, they've now gotten involved in re-entry services. So they're running halfway houses when people get out, you know, sometimes hiring the same guards that were guarding them inside now on the outside. So it is a you know, $1 billion corporation that's really set up that fueled the mass incarceration movement that Dr. Foy talked about, and has, you know, has profited for it. It's publicly traded, so it is a target of divestment movements as well. And so it's something that we should definitely be keeping on our radar and looking out for and be targeting against. And I think the way that they acted after California passed AB 32, you know, kind of shows you, you know, sort of the David and Goliath, who's David and who's Goliath, and the size of the industry that we're up against, which is based on the lies that we've just talked about in this thing. It's totally based on the lies that we've addressed and that you're continuing to help us with.
So I googled GEO, and it just says, it takes me to this Wall Street GEO group for stocks and real estate and all of that. So it's just the way they call themselves as a big corporation who are part of the big Wall Street system.
Thank you. Well, thank you everyone for your participation. It really made this webinar much more lively. Thank you for your comments, your questions. This concludes our webinar, and we hope to see you all again in 2 weeks in our third session of our Faith-Rooted Organizing series. Have a wonderful day and a weekend. Bye.
Bye-bye.